Hello there folks, back again with another video. In this time we're back to cover more Warhammer Age of Sigmar and another of the armies that came out recently for the new edition of the game, and that is the Gloomspite Gitz. So yes, I have had my hands on the Battletome and I've been flicking through it, seeing what catches my eye. And similarly to what we did with the Soulblight Gravelords, the focus of this is going to be on 5 things, more or less, that I think are super cool about the Gloomspite Gitz, and a reason for you to consider picking them up. We start with a very quick one, really, as part of this, and that is a little bit about their background and sort of who the Gloomspites are. So the Gloomspites are worshippers of the bad moon, as you might have imagined. But they also have something of a love for the sun in a strange way. The glare-face Frazzlegit, as they call it. So the majority of the Gloomspites still exist beneath the realms, as they were, across vast swathes of the Warhammer Age of Sigmar universe. But amongst their kind, there are also those that worship the sun in a strange way. So in an odd sort of twist, one of the things they've said is that the sun banishes the moon so incredibly easily that it must be a more powerful thing that they need to dominate in order to free the moon from its clutches. And so that's where you have the contrast between the Gitmobz and what you see for, the Gloomspite Gitz and what you get for the Gitmobz. And the Gitmobz are the ones that ride around on the surface of the realms, running around chasing down the sun and trying to destroy it. So that was one of the things that I was immediately drawn to when they talked about the new lore for what they were doing with the Gloomspite Gitz. Obviously, we have had the Night Golden aesthetic for a very long time, as always. But one of the things that we got recently was the addition of said flash Gitz that you see. Not flash Gitz. Technically, they are flash Gitz, I suppose. But the Gitmobz themselves, who ride around on the backs of all their walls and stuff like that, heading throughout the realms of Hish and things to try and hunt down the sun. And this leads me to another one of the cool things that I found quite recently, and that was in the map section of the book, as you can see here. It was really interesting diving into the way that the Gitmobz approach their fighting, because obviously a lot of the time you spend a lot of the Gitmobz efforts down beneath things in like Scrapper Spill and stuff like that, fighting beneath the world and all that kind of thing. But what we got here with this is we learned a little bit more about the packs of the Gitmobz that are riding around the realm of Hish. And in particular, you got a look at here with Zonquil's shortcut. And one of the nice things about this particular story, not to just read it verbatim, was the idea that the Gitmobz are sort of charging around this location that was essentially beforehand like fairly well defended by the forces of order, but now after what's happened with the Skaven and all that kind of thing, both the Lumineth Realm Lords and everyone else, the other forces of order, the Dwarves, etc., the Duardin, sorry, they're all having to work to try and combat this Gitmob threat that is rushing around the realm, trying to hunt them down. So there's a couple of things that have sort of really drawn my eye. I really like the kind of new background for what we're getting with the Gitmobz and the Gloomspite Gitz, and then that has turned quite nicely into a great set of background, lore, stories and things like that, which then build up around them on the tabletop. This also leads me to some interesting stuff about the Gitmobz themselves. So one of the things I really liked about them is that they have this sort of like resentment-based love of the sun, and you get this really interesting thing where they've been able to distill the power of Hish into their weaponry and some of their artifacts and use them as particular weapons that they use to destroy their enemies. You can see that there in that kind of glowing Hishian ring, that solar ring behind the back of the Wolf Rider there, and the weapon that he's using there on the front, so that's Trog's himself. This isn't to say that we're not missing out on some of the classic stuff. So the Troggoth herds are still very much part of the army, so you're going to be seeing them a lot alongside a lot of the classic Gloomspite Gitz themselves. Once again, with these books, they have really delved into sort of exploring the lore and the updates on them as a whole, sort of how they fit into the grand scheme of things. I also really like Scragrot, the Loon King, talking of the sort of classic Gloomspite Gitz themselves. He's a really interesting character. The Bad Moon spoke to him, or so apparently spoke to him, and he was the one who took over Scrapper's Spill and turned it into the kingdom that you see. If you've read any of the Gotrek and Felix, or Gotrek novels, I suppose, in Warhammer Age of Sigmar, you'll learn that there's a little bit of fun stuff around the idea of the goblins, the Gloomspites, and stuff like that, the Gitz, and sort of how they sort of work together. Well, how Gotrek and his companions worked out how to get inside and defeat the goblins and all that kind of thing, which is really cool. But Scragrot retains a lot of the elements of classic Night Goblin leaders of yore, sort of brought forward into the mortal realms, and that's one of the things that I was very much drawn to when it came to his particular character and how he fits into the lore and the background of Warhammer Age of Sigmar. Now this is the, and maybe I've added another bit in, because you have the rabble rousers. So these were characters that were added during the time of the Beast, which was in the last edition of the game. And the rabble rouser is amazing because, like Braggett Big Talker here, he sort of goads and chastises the rest of the Gitmobz and the Gloomspite Gitz to chase after him into battle, sort of revving them up almost. Think of him as like a Bez for your Gloomspite Gitz army, or your Gitmob army. And he's been able to like rouse the ire of the likes of Kragnos and all sorts of different things like that. Bring the Trogs and the Trogoths fight, surging over the hills to go fighting, and they're just a really funny addition to the range. And it's one of the things that I still like about the Gloomspite Gitz as a whole, is that a lot of their background and their lore and their miniature design is still very much focused around the idea of it just being fun and interesting, and a little bit of a hobby journey for those who are looking to do something a little bit different, maybe not something not so serious within the world of Warhammer Age of Sigmar. And I think that's been the task of goblins and orcs over the last little while. I think the orcs have become a little bit more serious with the addition of the Orc Warclans and the Cruel Boys, whereas the goblins have still retained a lot of that sort of fun factor, which I think is quite cool. And again, this was quite an interesting one because other Battletomes have only had sort of minor updates, maybe a few extra characters put in, or one character in the case of some. But this was a really interesting one for the Gloomspites because they essentially got a little bit of a range refresh alongside the other stuff for the Gloomspite Gitz that has already been out there. They didn't really invalidate or change anything too drastically, but they added in a lot of stuff that I feel was probably meant to go into Warhammer Age of Sigmar, Warhammer the Old World, but ended up in Warhammer Age of Sigmar instead. I don't necessarily mind that very much. I think it's quite cool that it's still in there. You still have the spider cults and all that kind of stuff, and the Arachnarok is still there, carrying over from previous iterations of the Gloomspites, the goblins, over the last few years. So yes, they have some fun stuff when it comes to the rules. Again, I told you this was a sort of 5 things. You still have the battle traits, the faction rules in there, and the ability for the Bad Moon to move around the battlefield, changing the way that the various elements of your army fight. So it might sometimes benefit the Squig Moon clans, the Spider Fangs, the Trogoths, or your regular Squigs, and that sort of rotates consistently around as you're playing your games. And then, of course, you have all of the classic stuff that you might expect. You have another version of Kragnos to throw into your forces on the tabletop, alongside things like Scragrot, Loon Bosses. There's one character in particular that I was quite interested to see. I like that they still continue to do this thing with the Battletomes as well, where they separate them out into themes. So you've seen just there we had like a Squig section, a main characters section. There's a full Trog and Trog boss and Trogoth style section. And this is where I find myself now. As you can see, I've marked it quite handily in the book. So I was always a massive fan of Trog. I think his name was Trog the Troll King, who was the guy from Warhammer the Old World, who was a troll who was carrying the crown of Nagash on his head, which had gifted him with a sense of power and intelligence that the rest of his people didn't have. That has then been sort of replaced and updated in the addition of Trog, the Trogoth King, who is the big character that you can get the special character for your Gloomspite Gitz on the tabletop. Instead of the crown of Nagash on his head, he instead carries the malfunctioning Laystone, which has unfortunately grown on top of him in his long slumber. And this then gives him a bunch of different benefits and updates, changes to his character and the way that he works on the tabletop, based on which of the glyphs have lit up on the top of his head. And it gets worse, or you don't get the option to find out what's going to happen and have some sort of agency over it the more he gets damaged, which I think is a really nice touch. But he's a very, very cool model, and it's really nice to see that he's in there, and it carries over those themes from Warhammer the Old World, Warhammer Fantasy Battles. And then one of the things I really like about this, about the Gloomspites, is that it carries on the same theme that we've seen across a lot of the other Battletomes, and there's a lot more freedom in the way that you build your armies. So you could go all heroes, you could go down a particular thematic route, you could optimize it to the nth degree, and in this case you could just run an entire army of trolls if you really wanted to go down that particular passageway. I still quite like as well that you have the updated rock gut Troggoths. Obviously we've seen versions of the stone trolls that they've updated from in Warhammer in the past, but you still have the classic fell water Troggoths who were done as a plastic kit, back during the sort of fading years, I suppose you'd say, of Warhammer Fantasy Battles before the end times and things like that. So it's nice to see that they're still legitimately part of this, and I don't think the designs look too drastically different from the new stuff, so I don't think they look too much of a problem on the tabletop. You also have all of the Gitmobz themselves, so if you were looking to run your Wolf Rider aesthetic style army, you still have that you can go down, sort of tie that into that kind of step-based aesthetic, bring your sort of barbarian hordes from over the hills and far away. This is the miniature that I was still surprised was in the book, the Webweaver Shaman, or the Webweaver Shaman. Very old, weird model. It's crazy that it's still there, but it is still there, and it's obviously a legitimate way for you to build a web spinner spider-based faction in your games, which is quite nice. Now, as always, there is a spearhead in there, which is based on the new one for the Gitmobz. One of the nice things about spearhead as well is that they haven't made it so any of the previous spearheads are invalidated. So if you do want to get your hands on a spearhead, you can obviously use the old one, or you could use this new one, which is quite cool. Obviously very wolf themed, so bear that in mind. And obviously there's all the tips for building them as an army on the tabletop and using them alongside the Path to Glory rules as well, which we've talked about in previous looks into the books. Capping things off though, as seems to be the case with a lot of these videos that I've been doing lately, we have a look at the Army of Renown that has particularly caught my eye, and in this case it is Daking's Gitz. Yes, I do like the idea of running like big troll armies and things like that, blah blah blah, blah. But I liked that we had the Army of the Round, which is the Daking's Gitz, which is led by Scragrot, who must be your general. You can then include any Moon Clan units, 0 to 1 Bad Moon Loon Shrine, 0 to 2 non-hero Troggoths, who act as his bodyguard, and you cannot include regiments of Renown. And that's where some of these comes in. So you have the Moon and the Loon, which is his awesome ability, as you can see there. Well, a friendly unit is wholly within 9 inches of a friendly Scragrot or a Bad Moon Loon Shrine, which is pretty powerful, so he acts as a beacon in his own right. You add 5 to the control score of non-squig Moon Clan units, which is cool, and you could also increase their movement value, which is good. There's also Daking's Guard, which is a friendly unit of Troggoth that basically act as Scragrot's enforcers. And I'd love to see someone do something with the modelling side of things, where you build them up as a more up-armoured version of the trolls to have alongside him. You also then have Daloon King's Court, which is D3 friendly, non-unique King Gitz heroes. They all get an enhancement, a little bit like the Barrow Legions got when we were looking at the Soulblight Gravelords book. And in this case, these are given similarly to that in the deployment phase rather than the army building phase. You then have a couple of heroic traits that can be given to your various characters. I was particularly drawn to the Glare Jester, which is quite nice and sort of thematically ties into the Rabble Rouser in some way. So you pick a friendly infantry unit within 3 inches of this unit and is not in combat. Roll a d3, add to the roll to the distance the target can move when using move abilities this phase. If the target unit enters a move in this phase within 3 inches of this hero, inflict an amount of mortal damage on it equal to the roll. So he eggs them on and gets them to chase after him, but then if they do actually catch up with him, they do beat him up, which I think is a nice little rule to add into the mix. And then you have your artifacts of power and your own specific spell lore and manifestation lore based around the power that Skragrott is able to wield. So yes, that was 5 or so things that I quite like about the Gloomspite Gitz and how they fit into the new edition of Warhammer Age of Sigmar with their newest Battletome, which, as I said before, has been out for a while, but I'm catching up, don't worry about it. Again, really beautiful artwork throughout, but one of the key things that I think is a good takeaway from this is that there's still a lot of the comedy and the fun baked into the Gloomspite Gitz, be that as the classic Gloomspite Gitz or the Gitmobz themselves riding around on the surface of the realms. There's still lots of different ways for you to build your force, lots of sneaky tricks that you can throw your enemies, still get your fanatics and all that kind of thing, or your backstabbers and your weird spells and the moon moving around the table. A lot of that's still been baked into the force as a whole. I'm not a tactical genius, so there may be some things that just don't make optimal sense, but in the grand scheme of things, I'm literally here just to talk to you folks about the theme and the ideas behind these forces and what that offers. And again, lots of interesting lore in here from the perspective of the Gitmobz and, for example, Drongs and stuff like that. So if you are interested in learning a little bit more about them and how they fit into the current edition of the game and the ongoing storyline, which has moved towards Gairan now in the 2025 to 2026 season, then it's definitely worth having a look and seeing what they're all about. Like, share, subscribe, do all that good stuff. Tell me what you think is awesome about Gloomspites. Do you enjoy them? Do you think they're very cool? What kind of army have you built? Let me know if you've had a look at the old Skragrott style thing and built an army based around that. It'll be fascinating to see where you've gone with your particular force. And yeah, I'll be back for another video very, very soon. So yes, dive in, tell me what you think, and I'll talk to you folks in the next video. Bye for now.